Right. Okay. Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. I'm going to hand over to Andre, who's going to talk a little bit about EBCU. Over to you, Andre.
Thank you, Brett. So my name is Andre Brunsberg. I'm the chairman or chairperson of EBCU, European Beer Consumers Union. And EBCU is an umbrella organization consisting of different beer organizations across Europe. We're active in, I think, 17 different countries, if I remember correctly now, and also have contact networks also to countries outside our member organizations. We work with many different fields, all from networking, helping out our member organizations to, for example, organize beer competitions and beer festivals, to lobbying on EU level, following up on legislation and so on, and also helping preserving traditional European beer styles as well, like, for example, Baltic Porter, which is typical style in northern part of Europe, and well, Sahti in Finland, and so on and so on. Grape sales in Italy. So there's a lot of things that we can be proud of here in Europe. And currently we have about representing around 180,000 beer consumers across Europe. So in that sense, we're definitely the voice of the beer consumer when it comes to talking out to, for example, the European Commission on legislation. I guess that goes for an intro.
Thank you, Andre.
And, thank you.
Thank you. Right, just a little bit of introduction from myself, but a little bit of administration. If you've got any questions for Tim, Tim will probably take the questions at the end, but please use the chat window for that. Just put your questions in and I'll go through them and read them out to Tim. The workshop will be put online, so you can download it later. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to join us tonight, then they can actually view it off the EBCU website. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. We're still trying to sort our program for March. So we don't have a March workshop yet. Provisionally, we'd like to do one on Kolsch, but we're still to resolve that one. In April, we've got an introduction to EBCU, but more of that later on. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Tim, and just to let you know, the workshop's should be finished by 8 o'clock, with a little bit of time leeway for questions and questions and answers afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Tim, and well.
Okay. Thanks very much, Brett. Yeah, I'm Tim Webb. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a beer writer. I write the World Atlas of Beer. I used to write The Good Beer Guide Belgium, a few other books. I always write from a consumer viewpoint because I've been a consumer activist since the early 1970s when I joined CAMRA in the UK. I was on the executive of the EBCU for however many years you're allowed to do it. And I'm still an associate dealing with publications for EBCU. I got into issues around climate change really very gradually and in a strange way, but I put this in the context of how beer has been doing since I conveniently arranged my birth at a point in the development of beer that was probably its low point of all time. By the time I arranged it so that I reached drinking age at a time that it was reached its low point of all time in the early 1970s. It's hard to believe now, but at that point, there were only really 4 beer cultures left. There were about a dozen other that had 1 or 2 interesting heritage beer styles, but no real beer culture. And I've watched in the last best part of 50 years how beer has regrown, how old heritage styles have come back, how new styles are being developed, about how the whole craft beer revolution has happened. But by any measure, the last couple of years has been extremely difficult. COVID got in the way of us socializing, so it got in the way of beer to a huge extent. We've also had Ukraine really wrecking lots of stuff to do with commodity prices and making beer very expensive and awkward to produce at times. My premise is that I think those two challenges have really just been a practice run for what's going to be a much bigger one, which is the impact of climate change. This guy, oh dear. First technical hitch, there we go. This guy is Lester Brown. And he has advised to date 5 different US presidents about the impact of climate change. He's a climatologist, environmentalist, and he's been following it for 30 years. And in 2012, by pure coincidence, I met him while on holiday. We were at one of these small boutique hotels where they make you all sit down around a long table. And I was sat opposite him for 2 successive evenings for about 3 hours each time. A fascinating man. I had to quiz him on environmentalism, but even as a journalist, I ran out of questions. So at one point I asked him, is the very stupid question, is there a simple way to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change? And he said, yes, be over 50. And that was in 2012. So in today's terms, be over 60. Brewing is a big trade. Brewing is about 4% of global industry, and it has a significant impact on the environment in 3 ways. The big one is carbon, but it also consumes a lot of fresh water, and it does use some chemicals in its production, which has potential for pollution. I'm going to stick with just the carbon footprint this evening. Firstly, because there are ways around the water issue, and it's being addressed, and it's quite clever, and it's quite time-consuming, but it's not the big issue. And as for the chemical pollution, well, it's very complicated and needs all sorts of techie solutions, and I don't understand any of them, so I don't think it's right that I should speak about them. However, if you look at carbon dioxide, the principle is very simple. Carbon dioxide and a few other gases, known as greenhouse gases, are in the atmosphere. If the amount of carbon dioxide goes up a bit, it traps heat in the atmosphere. That causes the surface temperature of the Earth to rise. That is what alters the climate. And when climate changes, that's what brings toxic weather to an extent that can be predicted at the moment to become so toxic that it becomes incompatible with humans living easily on the planet. The timing of that is a matter of some dispute. The fact that it's happening is no longer of any dispute. It's agreed that this is going to get out of hand within X years, and X may well be around 30. There are some who think it'll be as little as 10. Either way, it looks like the grandchildren of today's young adults are going to have to get this problem in order, or else look for a new planet to live on. This is my favorite of all slides, and I'm really hoping it's going to work, because I think if I press that one, maybe something else. I'm trying. It's a beautiful slide, and if I can get this video to work, which is beyond my capabilities, it will demonstrate the nature and extent of climate change. Oh, I can't do it. Brett, have you got any? I was looking for an arrow on this slide, but I can't see one. I'm not being given any click images.
No,
Maybe
it's not something. Oh
no, I've got no.
Okay. If you go back one.
And I'm doing all the things within my limited capabilities.
Something down at the bottom, yeah. That.
Yeah, I can print it, I can find it, I can run it, but I can't. Never mind. Too clever. But anyway, what this would show, if it was running, that green circle there is equilibrium of the climate temperature of the environment. And starting from 1880, what you would see if it was running properly is that actually the Earth was cooling a little bit from 1880 onwards, and it remained that way up until the First World War, when briefly it went above that 0 mark, came back again. In the early 1970s, it started to warm, and it's increased at an increasing rate. At the end of the video, it's from NASA, and at the end of the video, it takes the circles and it turns them through 90 degrees, and you see a shape that's a bit like a flower vase opening up like that, and it's quite striking. It's on the web. It's from NASA. You should be able to find it. To understand brewing's impact on carbon footprint and climate change, you've really got to rethink how you look at brewing. That image there, I think, is pretty close to how better informed consumers, many brewers, look at the brewing process. It's very much about a load of machines that start by milling malt, doing the mash, doing some lautering, boiling, whirlpooling, etc., and then preparing the beer for, and the stuff that goes on before they get to the brewery and the stuff that goes on after it leaves the brewery is of lesser concern. That's not how environmentalists look at it. An environmentalist will break this down into segments, and starting with the ingredients, they look at the fact that beer is made from grain. Grain may feel and that it's an environmentally friendly thing to grow, but if you think about think tractors, think sprays, think harvesting, and you realize there are carbon impacts for that. You've also then, of course, got to take the grain for storage, etc., which we'll come to. Hops are kind of easier. Hops might even be carbon negative, which is actually what we've got to try and make the whole process. It's no use getting into carbon equilibrium anymore. We've actually got to get carbon negative. However, as we'll see in a moment, it's what happens to the hops after they've been cropped that's the problem. Yeast is a primary offender. Yeast makes CO2, but actually the quantity of yeast made during brewing, the quantity of CO2 made during brewing or made during fermentation is pretty negligible compared to the whole. Looking at another ingredient, water. Water itself is pretty neutral, but it's the whole rigmarole of how you get the water supply to the brewery and how you prepare the water supply that is produces CO2. So taking just a slightly quick additional look at that. Yeah, good. Thinking about grain. Grain is grown over most of the inhabitable parts of the world. It's an absolute staple. But for some reason, brewing grain is carted all over the planet. And well, I say for some reason, that's usually in the most part, it's because brewers are forever seeking the cheapest ingredients. And one of the great ways to get cheap stuff across the whole of the modern world is to grow it in places where people aren't paid very much, or else grow it in places where they've got dazzling efficiency and large-scale production, and then cart it all around the world. That builds up an awful lot of carbon miles. Hops are less of a problem. in that sense, though there are only a certain number of countries that can grow them, they're less of a problem because the quantity of hops used in a beer is a lot less than the amount of grain. So the amount of shipping around that has to be done is less. But even so, preparing the hops for usage, nowadays virtually everything is pelletized, and some of the better extracts can involve being produced at incredibly low temperatures, which is carbon intensive. Yeast are not entirely without a CO2 production attached to their preparation. Yeast propagating systems will produce CO2. Not a big problem unless you're one of those brewers who decides to fly out once a week their yeast from American yeast labs and produce them. You use them fresh each time. In Europe, there are some breweries that do that. I've already mentioned the water infrastructure being quite intensely carbon productive.
Tim, just to let you know that the video is now available in the chat window, so people are already watching it now.
Oh, okay.
The little animation. So there's a couple of links. Andre's put one. I've put one as well. So if people go on the chat window, they can view it there.
Great. Now, moving to the next part, I think I've missed a slide. Oh yeah, delivering to, that's right, delivery to the brewery. That's I've dealt with it. And then there is production. And of course, production involves lots of machinery, and it involves in the first parts of production, it's really all about heat and generating heat for the mash and the boil. Towards the latter part of production is fermentation and that other one, conditioning. It's more about applying cold to the system, but that is equally intensive. The next part of the environmental impact is packaging. I'm just top right here, I'm putting in the cask because the cask potentially looks like one of the most environmentally friendly forms of packaging. Canning, bottling, kegging all involve machinery, all involve. The more subtle thing is that they all involve packages, and we'll come to that in a moment. Then there is delivery, and delivery is massive. Delivery, it's particularly large nowadays because a large number of a large portion of the beer produced in the world is now produced in a single brewery per country. And so the trunking lines of beer from the brewery to the point of sale are often extremely long, measured in hundreds of miles and kilometers. The other part of the delivery conundrum, and the one that is grossly underestimated when people are thinking about the environmental impact of beer, is refrigeration. Now, there's two aspects to refrigeration. To have a cold chain that runs continuously from the brewery of production to the point of sale is essential to beer quality. There's no question about that. There is a question about what temperature do you need to keep that cold chain at? There are companies that are sending stuff through near ice cold temperature from brewery to point of sale. Is that actually necessary? Certainly to keep it below 12 degrees looks to be pretty sensible. Some would argue slightly higher. The other aspect of refrigeration is at the point of sale, be that a shop or a bar. And people have become a lot more aware of this since the energy issues that many countries have because of Ukraine. And there are a lot of claims going about that in retail environments, it's something like 1/3 of the energy usage is keeping beer and other drinks cool or cold. certainly the cost in the transport end of things, transportation of beer, it is at least a third of the transportation costs is keeping things cold. I think it's finally circularity, recycling, reusing, etc. There is an environmental target that I think the brewing industry has set on itself, which is 100% circularity of containers, be that kegs, cans, bottles, casks, whatever. This is, I think, the point at which I'm going to suggest we look at the medals table. Very important to understanding some green issues. You get a gold medal for not using something at all, giving up using it. That is a gold standard environmental saving. However, I am from a generation, and my children and grandchildren are from generations where we've been told that you can have it all and you can have it now. And doing without is not in our genes. But doing without is the best standard. The silver medal goes to reusing stuff. That is the critical issue on much of the packaging issue. Recycling gets the bronze medal. It's better than doing nothing, but it's not as good as reuse, and it's not as good as not using it all. So lots of different factors there, and the question arises, how much do they contribute individually to the overall carbon footprint of the brewing industry? And this is where you start to hit problems. At the last count, there had been 14 very high quality studies, and I think it's in the 30s of studies that have looked at it partially, looking at what the relative contributions of different environmental impacts are in brewing. There is a problem because these studies are not done in the same way. They look at issues in different ways, so direct comparison can be difficult. There's a problem because the environmental factors in different brewing nations are actually different. The relative contributions, I could take an easy example. In Germany, the cost of using hops is going to be lower because they're self-sufficient in hops. Whereas in a country that has no hops, that'll be a higher factor. However, if you take two of the best studies, one of which was sponsored by the Brewers of Europe, the other one was sponsored, I think, by the Institute of Brewing in the UK, they used different methods to look at the same problem. And actually, when you strip down what they found, there's ways of putting the figures together that make them very similar in their conclusions. Although the Brewers of Europe looked separately at what agriculture needed to do, what the ingredients preparers needed to do, and what the delivery systems to get stuff to breweries needed to do, the UK didn't. They just looked at everything before the brewery. They still came to recognizably similar percentages there. So if I turn those into a pie chart, that's what it ends up looking like roughly. So agriculture, probably less than 10% contribution to the total carbon footprint impact. Preparation and delivery between them around 17%, significant. One of the interesting ones for me is that the whole of the production stuff, the thing that goes from grinding the malt through to putting the beer in a package, is only 10%, 10 or 11%. The whole packaging thing of taking things from the point at which the beer is about to be put into the package through to the package or returning to the brewery or meeting its end point, 25%. And the big, sorry, 35%. Sorry about that. And the other big one is delivery, which is estimated to take 25%. The estimates about how much of that is refrigeration vary. In hot countries, which have got long supply chains and have issues where they really do want to look after their beer, that can be up around 2/3 of that is refrigeration costs. But that's roughly what you're looking at. So, well, actually, I could at this point, Brett, take questions. If people have got questions on how, what we're going to come to is how the large breweries are addressing this, and then what the options are for smaller breweries going forward. If anybody's got queries about that data to date, I'm happy to take them now.
There's nothing there at the moment, Tim. Okay.
Right. In that case, let's move on to what's being done about this. You all, this well-informed audience will no doubt know that over half of all the beer in the world is made by 4 companies. I think I'm right in saying that shouldn't say Asahi, that should say Japanese Brewing, because there are 4 large Japanese firms. It's just that they don't compete with each other in the open market. They kind of run hand in hand, so I count them as the 4th largest brewery in the world: Asahi, Kirin, Suntory, and Sapporo. What these 4 have in common is that they've made huge public pledges. They're on their websites, they are announced at public meetings, they have been put into print in documents, and they are unquestionably what these companies intend. Starting with the biggest, AB InBev. They published widely on this, but taking a few of their headlines, they're intending to go all renewable source energy by 2025, by which time they'll also have a 1/4 reduction in carbon emissions. The whole business to be net zero by 2040, that may well be too late. But comparing it to other industries, that's not an ambitious target. That's quite creditable. The bit that I find highly creditable is that they are refusing to take into account their offset schemes. You'll probably all be familiar with offset schemes that if you wish to pay an extra 2% on your ticket, the airline will plant lots of trees and offset the carbon dioxide. Offset schemes are very dodgy. For a tree planting scheme to offset the amount of carbon that you're allowed to say you'll offset, those trees have to grow in reasonable conditions and undisturbed for 50 years. That's a very long period for trees to grow, and that's an awful lot of planet space taken up. And while nobody has any objection to people planting massive numbers of trees and regreening the earth, there are going to be limitations to how much of that can be done. And so offset schemes are a bit, be skeptical. Heineken, one of the things that's interesting about the pledges that these companies have made is they're different from each other. Heineken for 2025 concentrates on landfill, zero landfill. They're very much taken with that. And although they're going to reduce their emissions, they'll just reduce them from distribution. They're not saying by how much they're going to reduce them. For ingredients, sustainably sourced ingredients, net zero in their production facilities by 2030, a lot tighter target. And then, interestingly, this last one comes in: zero tolerance of harmful use of alcohol. This is in their greening of the company. That's an interesting one. Because when you move to Carlsberg, it's in there too: 0 time lost to accidents in the business, all markets to improve responsible drinking. Interesting seeing that as a green target. Again, carbon emissions reduced. Carlsberg's specialty is to do individual projects to restore the environment. There is, in the UK, one of the things they're doing is restoring seagrass, which is very, very lovely thing to do. And I'm all in favor of it. It's wonderful. And for Carlsberg to sponsor it, then yep, that's absolutely fine. Seagrass apparently has multiple facets to it. improving carbon stores in the seas. And it does, I've forgotten the other, it does two other things. It's a remarkable thing. And for Carlsberg to be behind it, absolutely fine. They've also concentrated on water reduction and again, zero carbon at breweries by 2030. Asahi's not actually the fourth largest, it's the fifth largest. Molson Coors comes fourth. And I haven't included Molson Coors because I have not been able to source a Molson Coors document that actually says what they're going to do. They use all the right words when they're talking about greening, but I haven't been able to find a list of actual targets. If you know where it is, and then please send it to me, and I shall duly read it and add it to this talk. Asahi has the most impressive set of pledges. It's on the Asahi Group Holdings website, which is the firm that owns Asahi and various other businesses. Again, 100% renewable energy by 2025, reduction in carbon emissions from distribution. This weird one, reduction in harmful drinking, with a fascinating tag to it. 15% of all beer sales for Asahi will be no and low alcohol. Probably very green. Not sure how, but it's probably very green. A lot of key performance indicators on the website, particularly around sustainably sourced materials, a specific CO2 emission target of 70%, apart from the general one of saying that they'll reduce it from distribution, a specific overall target, by 2030, and zero CO2 emissions by 2050, which is more typical, but 10 years slower than AB InBev. Now, what do you take from this? Well, the first thing I take from it, and those of you who know me will know I'm incredibly skeptical about what global brewers are trying to do and how they go about doing it. But I think the fact that these pledges have been made publicly and are clearly talked about as permanent changes to a business model, I think they are strengthened by that, and I give these firms credit for that. There's a slightly subtle one that a lot of these things that are being claimed actually are not what the brewery companies will do, it's what their suppliers will do. I mean, okay, they can lean on suppliers to make sure that they are done. They can even say, well, if you don't meet these targets, we'll find another supplier. But it's not actual internal changes that are being made, it's use on external influence. The key targets are very vague in a lot of cases, and I think that's because of the previous line. They are not holding their suppliers' feet to the fire and saying, you must hit these targets. They're basically saying, please do as much as you can, because we will then show that in our figures as to how good we're being. The other two things that I think are interesting is that there's a lot of focus on the emissions from the brewing process. But if you remember that pie chart, that's only about 10 or 11% of the total. And there's very little mention in any of the sets of figures about the packaging issue that takes up 35% of the total, or the distribution from brewery to point of sale issue. That's where they're at their vaguest in saying they'll reduce emissions for that area, but not quite saying how. AB InBev have gone a couple of baby steps in that direction, saying that they are going to, they're considering moving to lightweight, durable plastic kegs. That's so that the loads being taken by delivery pantechnicons are going to be lighter, therefore using less fuel. They're also trialing electric vehicles, and I think there's a lot of industry, not just the brewing industry, that's putting a lot of stock in creating these electric vehicles, not simply as cars for people to drive around in, but to be able to maintain this tradition of having enormously long supply lines, both from ingredients to brewery and from brewery to point of sale. There's nobody questioning at the moment, not in public at any rate, whether they should actually be thinking about attacking those long supply lines as being the actual cause of much of the problem. At this point, just allow me to take a break because I need to lubricate my throat because I can. Brett, are there any questions coming in so far?
Yeah. So do we know what percentage of the world's hops production is from sustainable sourcing?
I don't personally. I know quite a lot about the hop industry. I don't. Sustainable. Yeah, plants. As far as I'm aware, hops continue to grow. Hop plants replace hop plants, replace hop plants, and regrow and regrow and regrow. There are certainly soil issues. There are certainly environmental issues with hops. Hops need, you may well know, they can only grow between certain latitudes on the planet because they need a certain amount of sunlight for at least, I think it's 14 hours sunlight for 5 months of the year. Off the top of my head, that may not be completely accurate. They're quite delicate. They don't like particular wind conditions. They don't like particular climates in terms of the amount of rain being much too high or much too low. They don't like very high temperatures. They don't like being frozen.
Astrid, if you want to unmute yourself, then feel free to ask the question verbally. It's absolutely no problem with that. It's quite easy to do that tonight. Now we've got everyone sorted. And same goes for, yeah, hi.
Yeah, sorry, I have a cold, but I hope you can understand me. Yeah, my question is more like, we have that discussion from sustainable sourcing, like organic production. And everybody says, okay, we need more organic hops in the production, but nobody, and especially in Germany, hardly anybody produces organic hops. So that was my question. How do they want to,
Yeah, that overlaps with the whole organic issue. I should point out before what I'm going to say that I'm a supporter of organic farming. I'm a believer in it. I will get organic whenever I can. The first line of this slide that I'm just about to do, greenwashing is essential to image. The amount of greenwashing that's going on is enormous, and sometimes it's large companies trying to tell stories that aren't really true about what they're doing. Sometimes it's sectors of the economy using the whole green thing to boost the standing of the sector. Now, I've looked at some of the stuff that organic improvements to the environment from the organic side. If you're looking at the chemical issue, it's a strong case. I wouldn't argue it. The water issue, I'm really not sure whether there's much difference. On the carbon issue, yes, there is a difference, but it looks to me to be pretty small. So environmentally friendly thing to do, certainly. And with hops, I know there are a lot of technical issues of trying to get hops to the pretty rigorous standards that the general market wants. To grow organic hops carries with it. In the UK, it's impossible because our soil conditions, we seem to attract such a wide array of bugs in the soil that when people are trying to do organic hops, so there's some have grown, I believe, but it's a really difficult thing to do on a large scale. So I think there are technical issues purely and simply from the carbon footprint. It's a factor, but it's not a massive factor. I think the whole the greening of hop growing, I know I won't name them, but I know a very, very keen brewer, a leading craft brewer, who'd be very keen to get organic hops. They actually go for as organic as they can get, because when they've used pure 100% bio hops, it's had effects on the beer that they can't even necessarily explain, but it's not quite up there. So sorry for a long and probably technically flawed answer, but it's a complex issue, organic hops. course, I could have seized up, and it's very bizarre talking to a screen and not seeing anybody and just trusting it's all working properly. Brett,
I've got another question.
that's all right. Okay, fine.
Tim.
Yeah.
The problems, wait, I think it's a comment as much as from Hans Peter. The problems about distribution and packing are not specific to beer, I think. The same almost for all foodstuffs and drinks, he assumes.
I would go beyond foodstuffs and drinks. People have to have very long and rather geeky memories to recall that when COVID first began and half the world closed down in a couple of days, there were all sorts of runs on all sorts of commodities in lots of countries. And there wasn't any panic buying. The panic buying to run out of toilet rolls, which was one of the favorite things in the UK. You know there's a crisis because we've run out of toilet rolls. There only has to be, I think it's a 4% increase, or maybe 7% increase in the number of toilet rolls bought, and the whole supply chain ends, because industry and consumerism and the thing I said earlier about we've been told, we're several generations of people who've been told that you can have it all and you can have it now, is entirely dependent on shipping these things all around the world and then shipping them all around countries. And it's virtually everything. Everything you buy is run to a business model like that by some industry or another. In brewing, it's most obvious with grain, where you've got perfectly decent grain being grown 5 miles up the way, and yet you get yours from Canada crossing the Atlantic because it's a bit cheaper. This model of doing things in the cheapest possible way is actually going to get challenged. I'll come to that in a moment as to how it'll be challenged, but Hans Peter, I agree. It affects everything in all consumables and everything else we buy. Let me get on to this sort of greenwashing. This is I put this in just for a bit of balance, because everybody is used, probably I think in most countries, all the foods, every food you buy is good for you in some way, and there are lots of claims about the goodness of this and that and the nutrition of this and that. And when you dig down to what it's actually about, it's some tiny marginal effect is what's being marketed and being attached to the brand. Exactly the same thing is going on with environmental claims currently, and it's really difficult to find your way through. At the moment, there isn't well, there probably are, but there's not a very well-known website you can go to that tells you the truth about the green impact of various things. The other point is it's actually very complicated. The science on this is changing literally every week. There are advances to be able to do things in a more carbon-friendly way. Equally, there are recognitions that something that looks very carbon-friendly is not actually, because there are subtle carbon costs in other parts of the process. There's a second thing going on. Big breweries want government support, I think more than they have done in the past. They feel unloved. They know that if they're going to keep their business models going, there's got to be a certain governmental nod in their general direction. And I think that's what the harm reduction stuff is about. That's what the zero alcohol stuff is about. It's staying on side with government. That. I've already covered this next point about the one brewery per country model, but it is fundamental to why things cost a lot in carbon terms. I'm sure that running one brewery per country costs less in money terms, and that's where the rub is. Oops, sorry. Yeah, and the other one that's quite subtle is this packaging circularity, because if you think of beers, the number of beers, particularly in bottles, particularly in cans. Well, actually, it's bottles I'm talking about. Any sort of distinction in the presentation of the beer, distinct bottles, creates a heck of a problem if you're trying to get 100% circularity. Let's take a silly example. I just brought a case of Nillis, which, if you don't know, Nillis is the first ever alcohol-free Trappist beer, and it comes from La Trappe. Taking the bottles back, very difficult, because they've all got little embossed glass sticky out bits or something or other. Those are unique bottles. Those, I assume, will disappear if we've got to have 100% circularity of packaging, unless it's worked out that actually crushing and recycling the glass of bottles works out more carbon efficient than sending them all back and reusing them. Why do large breweries emphasize so much the efforts they're making to make their production greener? Well, firstly, it's because large breweries are easier to green than smaller breweries. There are techniques you can use that are much easier to apply on a large scale than on a small scale. Carbon capture, for example, but there's many other examples. The other thing is image. That image there on the left of a factory that's polluting its water supply and shoving horrible smoke out in the atmosphere, that's an easy target. People can see that that's anti-environmental. Look at a frosty pint. Does that look anti-environmental? That's 10 or 11% of the problem. That's about 12% of the problem. And that's going to be a very interesting one to shift. I've seen some data that suggests that if the average serving temperature of a beer goes up 1 degree, and remember, a lot of beers are served at 4, 5, 6 degrees. If it goes up to 5, 6, 7 degrees instead, saves 1% of the carbon problem, and the same for the next percent, and the same for the next degree percent, and the same for the third one. It's certainly not all bad news, and I think the only reason that people who write about environmental things stick with it is because there is quite a lot of good news coming over the horizon. The amount of renewable energy is rising, and if you've got renewable energy that is carbon free, that can only be a good thing. It's a win-win all round. Equally, carbon capture technology is improving, and there's more to be expected there. How far green trucking will proliferate? Well, we'll see. I am currently, instead of planting a field of cider apples in the field in my little farm down there, if you own a little farm, you've only got 5 acres, it's very difficult to work out what to do with it. I think I've worked out that planting solar panels is going to be significantly more profitable and useful for the environment than planting cider apples, which was the original plan. Whether or not, once we've got our electric points on the road, selling our solar sourced energy direct, whether or not that'll be enough to fill up the trucks that deliver to the quarry just down the way in enough time, not sure. The whole thing looks to me to be very difficult indeed, and I think relying on that to deal with the 25% delivery costs is optimistic. Carbon taxes will come in. I wish the prime ministers and finance ministers who introduced these to their populations, I wish them the very best of luck with this. You've got to tax carbon out of the economy, and if you do, you'll probably lose your job as a politician, because although we all say we love it as citizens, when we have to pay for it, it's a different matter. High quality, high tech hop extracts. These, I was talking to a number of people in the hop industry. Hop extracts of the type that you might bring to mind capture about 80–85% of hop flavors. The stuff that's now being produced, highly pressured and pressed at -40 degrees centigrade, is incredibly impressive. Blind tastings of beers made from that and from whole hops, you have to have a better palate than mine to be able to tell the difference. And I think that technology will be driven by the need to, by definition, ship hops all around the world. If you're having to ship basically a sack, no, basically five sacks of hops, and that's something like 40 bags of pellets. That bottle is larger than that amount of hop. Slightly more difficult to use, but the hop injectors are now getting so accurate that you can probably get around that already. So I think the way forward with hops is going to be taking the working bits out of them in a much more technically clever way. Organic production is already increasing. As I said earlier, that helps. It probably doesn't help as much as people think, but it does help, and therefore should be encouraged. Waste products finding different use. My favorite one is spent grain cakes, which I seem to be going around the world trying, because people are really pleased with them when they get bakers to use used grain. They do have a certain something to them, and they taste like the sort of bread that you know is good for you, keeps you regular and all that. Finally, packaging will change, and I have no idea how. I'm looking forward to the Brewers of Europe conference in Prague in May, because they're promising they're going to be announcing lots of new research in this area. No idea what it's going to say. The last time anything official came out, bottles and cans were more or less equal in their efficiency. The kegs and even casks, they were looking at how often they are reused. And the difficulty with reuse for kegs and casks is one of, oh, we don't use that at our brewery. As if you've got something that isn't seen by the general public. There are 50 different varieties of it. Quite questionable as to why that is. Are there really 50 different sets of advantages and disadvantages, or should the industry be starting to use just 3 or 4 different types of keg, maybe 2 different sorts of cask? Turning quickly to smaller brewers, so more or less going to the end. As I say, larger brewers are easier to green, smaller companies less so. There are companies set up very specifically to do bespoke packages for small breweries. Small breweries vary considerably, but these companies have said they are perfectly willing to be commissioned by, for example, a national association of small breweries to give advice on, say, 3 different small brewery types, and to give pointers as to how you can green the brewery without having to use the massive large-scale stuff that AB InBev, Heineken, etc. use. There is another factor for smaller brewers. If you looked at this purely financial eyes, you'd probably say it's not worth doing a lot of this. It's a lot of effort, it's a lot of cash, and it is not. It's really not affordable. However, the problem is the craft beer drinkers, if you can generalize that much, have got a far bigger stake in greening the planet, and they expect their suppliers to do it. So small brewers aren't going to get the option not to do it. From a beer consumer point of view, the one downside I think we have to acknowledge is that most beers in the import-export trade are going to become a lot more expensive. Certainly talking about the UK at the moment, our biggest factor in beer prices is tax. That's the case for large parts of Northern Europe. Whether the import-export will be noticed as much is questionable if you've got high taxation. And the other thing is that small brewers are definitely going to have some major opportunities in this. This is one of my favorite quotes. Ketil Jökull from the founder of Noga in Norway. Apologies to anybody who knows how to pronounce Norwegian. That's my closest approximation. I think it was about 15 years ago, he was quoted saying, small brewers can never compete on price. He actually went on to say, don't bother to. You can only ever compete on quality. And I think it's the same argument really in this green debate, because what small breweries have is they have local. And I don't just mean they have local short runs to supply local shops, the local town. They also have the capacity, and a lot of these brewers well established are as good technical brewers as the larger brewers are. And it would be very interesting if they were commissioned to make particular beers on a local scale, and how the large companies would take to that as an idea, and also how the general public would take to it as an idea. The idea that you can have your Heineken or your Stella Artois brewed by your local brewery would be a very interesting one. I'm only floating that as a silly idea, nowhere near as silly as the one that I really would like to see take off, which is, I think we should seriously consider pushing for the idea that a certain percentage of all beer sold in any bar or any shop must be produced within a certain distance of that bar or shop. I started arguing that 80% should be brewed within 50 kilometers. I've been persuaded that's possibly a little ambitious, but hey ho, interesting to hear your thoughts. Reusable packaging schemes strike me as having to be coming along. Maybe small brewers are in better positions to do that because they're not quite so invested on having that funny little design feature. So I think there's some mileage there. But whatever happens, I can see that small brewers are going to need to double down on their whole issue of local awareness, and at the same time double down on growing a reputation for provenance, either provenance of making a particular beer in a particular way by a particular method, or provenance in the sense of genuinely being from where the beer seems to suggest it's coming from. So my predictions on how beer will change: more locally sourced grain, a bit of more local hops, but my real prediction is that there'll be high-tech extracts. I think for all sorts of reasons, local provenance is going to rise as a thing in consumers' minds, the average consumer's mind, not the beer geek. And I think quite a lot of the aspects of beer will in some ways go back 100 years before there were, before US prohibition, to when things were done on a more human scale. But we will have the advantages that a lot of modern technology really is very good. Do I worry about it? Well, not really, because I'll still be over 60. That's it. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you, Tim. That was superb and spot on time as well. Thanks to everyone who took part, and thanks for your questions. I'm just trying to see if there's any other questions that have come in. No, I think we've covered everything there. So thanks, Tim. Thanks to everyone. If anyone wants to ask any questions verbally, feel free to unmute now and ask away. Otherwise, we'll just close the call at this point.
Thank you, Tim, for the presentation. I think one thing that crossed my mind is that now that it seems that we have a lot of these more traditional beer styles coming back, and not everything is not IPA anymore and so on. And maybe that's also an effect that, let's say, the global prices has, but that also I assume would have a bit of an environmental effect in a positive thing when it comes to not having hops from, let's say, Yakima Valley and so on. So
I think it's going to be, I just think that before Hans Peter says it, this doesn't just apply to beer. I think a lot of local sourcing, feeling that something's come from a local place, is going to be a big trend in the next 10, 20 years. And a bit like the other changes that have to be made for climate change, I think it may be permanent. I think there may be a permanent change. I think part and parcel of that is you make something obviously more local if it's your local or national style of beer. So I can see that moving that way. In addition, my worries with the very local, very traditional beers is they have got a taste good enough for the average Stella drinker to not completely turn their nose up at it. But there's got to be a certain accessibility. And because you know me, I've drunk everything everywhere, and some certain beers I find quite challenging. Anyway.
Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. And some I don't know if you can see the chats. A lot of thank yous there, Tim. Thanks for the interesting presentation. Oh, sorry, we've had a late one come in. Which is better, disposable, recyclable materials or reusable? Because for something to be reusable, it must be washed and wasting a lot of water and polluting that water. Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it?
Absolutely. I remember going to Svalbard, which is the northernmost inhabited island, or certainly the northernmost inhabited island with a brewery in the world. It's only about 900 kilometers from the North Pole. They have a brewery there, a brilliant brewery, for the whole of the islands, because it's in the pristine Arctic. There are strict rules about everything, including containers. And he was only allowed to use key kegs and cans. He wasn't allowed to use bottles for that very reason. They needed to be washed. And I think it's a very good example of something where the science is changing all the time, and the way that people are looking at it is changing all the time, because we haven't got our agreed currency of environmental issues. There's no, if you're thinking about environmental impact, there's not yet an agreed trade-off of carbon versus water pollution. And unquestionably, there's a huge amount of really clever stuff being done, but the answers are not definite yet, and I think will change. And I say to any, we've been advising CAMRA on how it should make its decisions. And one of the most important things has been, don't get dogmatic, do not stick to a particular point, because the science will change and you'll be out of date almost as soon as you've said it. So it's quite difficult you've got to remain alert to things and be able to react to developments. So yeah.
That sounds a good place to finish. Thanks very much, Tim, and much appreciated. And keep your eye on the website, folks, for future workshops and all about beer presentations. Hopefully we'll have some more listed soon. Take care, everyone, and have a very good evening. Bye-bye.